This historical marker is located at the corner of Joe B. Hall Avenue and Walnut Street, next to the Ridgeway Library in Shepherdsville. It was provided in 2009 by the Bullitt County Public Libraries, with research for the marker provided by the Bullitt County History Museum. Much of what you will see and hear in this video was first created for a special meeting at the library on December the 20th, 2017, to mark the 100th anniversary of the worst train wreck in Kentucky history. Present at this event were many descendants of the people who were involved in that train wreck. This video is dedicated to them. On December 20th, 1917, the local Accommodation train pulled into Shepherdsville after sunset. While local patrons disembarked and additional passengers boarded the local train, the Cincinnati to New Orleans Flyer Express train bore down on Shepherdsville. Moments later, a collision left death and destruction in its wake. This is the story of that terrible time. Before we share the events that occurred that fateful day, it will be useful to review the railroad history leading up to it. The first train to Shepherdsville arrived in October 1855. It carried city authorities, newspaper men, railroad officials, and as many of the general public as could get aboard. Work was begun immediately on the Salt River Bridge. From the beginning, working on the railroads was dangerous. Accidents were frequent, and deaths were unfortunately common. 2 trains collided at Bardstown Junction in August 1860, with injuries to Joseph Smithers and William Smith. Johnny Wallace, a train fireman, was killed in a collision between a passenger train and a freight train at Belmont in June 1874. In 1882, engineer George Minot was piloting a heavy freight train north out of Shepherdsville. He had just applied steam to his engine to clear the rise ahead when a brace of mules suddenly appeared on the tracks. In the collision that followed, the locomotive left the tracks, followed by several loaded freight cars. Minot was found dead, crushed beneath his locomotive. On Christmas Eve, 6 years later, a mail train was standing at Bardstown Junction when an express train rounded the bend at high speed. It crashed into the last passenger car, splitting it apart before plunging into the next one. Had that final car been filled with passengers, the death toll would have been terrible. However, it was being towed empty to join another train later. Still, the deaths and injuries that did occur shocked the onlookers. These are just a handful of the accidents, injuries, and deaths that occurred in the early decades following the opening of the rail line. T.C. Coleman, shown here, was a Louisville businessman with ties to the railroad. He was responsible for getting a small railroad station located near his home in Bullitt County. Because of its location between Coleman and McDonald Knobs, shown here, it bore the name Gap and Knob. In the years since then, the railroad bed through the gap has been lowered to beneath the highway. But in those days, trains approaching the station from either direction had to climb a rise to reach the gap. Additionally, the track north of the station curved around the side of the knob. This reduced visibility, particularly in the early evening at sunset. This was especially true on Christmas Eve, 1899. That foggy evening there was a mist of rain falling, hindering the view. As the passenger train slowed to a stop at this station, a heavy freight train made its way southward close behind. Because of the fog, the freight engineer did not see the passenger train until it was too late to fully stop. The freight struck the coach, smashing the rear end. The jolting passed through each of the coaches, creating panic and confusion. The rear panels of the coach were splintered and jagged by the force of the impact. They crushed Cora Carruthers against the seat in front of her, binding her in a vice-like grip. Death came almost instantly. Also aboard that train were Alice May, Ben Talbot, and Frank Darty. None were badly injured, but all would carry this memory 18 years later as they approached another Christmas aboard the same train. In this turn-of-the-century photo, you can see the Shepherdsville depot on the right. The Salt River Bridge is visible in the far distance. The train shown here was on the northbound tracks. The southbound tracks are on the right, next to the depot. The middle set of tracks were actually a siding to be used when one train needed to allow another to overtake and pass it. This photo shows the railroad bridge from the south side of Salt River. The railroad had separate north and southbound tracks all the way from Louisville to Lebanon Junction. However, this bridge could only accommodate one train at a time, hence the need for the signal tower shown here. Unfortunately, in November 1903, things didn't work as planned. In the early morning hours, two freight trains approached Shepherdsville from opposite directions. A heavy fog rose off the river, obscuring vision, particularly on the south side of the river. The signal had been given for the southbound train to cross the bridge first, but the northbound train did not see it for the fog and proceeded toward the bridge. In the ensuing crash, 2 were killed, several injured, and both trains were heavily damaged, as noted in the newspaper headlines. Newspaper headlines would repeatedly call to attention the names of those who were injured or killed in railroad mishaps. Orleans Lee, 84 years of age, and one of Bullitt's most honored citizens, was killed by a fast train near his home at Belmont, this county, this morning. He was walking along the track and, being very deaf, did not hear the approaching train. The Courier-Journal, Sunday, the 29th of October, 1905. There would be others. Chrissy Lee Bell, a brakeman, was killed at Bardstown Junction when he stumbled while making a switch and fell beneath the moving train. William T. King, a conductor, was killed in a wreck at Bardstown Junction. Mrs. Mac Jones, Mrs. Yetta Patterson, and the 2 children were seriously injured when their wagon was struck by a train near Bardstown Junction. Joseph Ernest Bowman, age 18, and a locomotive fireman, was killed at Lebanon Junction when run over by several cars. And John Thomas Payne, a railroad employee, was killed in the Lebanon Junction yard while inspecting cars to be added to a train. These, as well as others, demonstrated the dangers of life on the railroad. Continuing forward, we now come to 1917. In May, 11-year-old John Robert Hoagland was walking along the tracks with Jimmy Morrison when he was struck and killed by a locomotive near his home. His father, Thomas Hoagland, sued the railroad over his son's death. The case would come to trial just before Christmas, and young Jimmy Morrison was scheduled to be a witness. With the beginning of December, Christmas was fast approaching, the first Christmas since America had entered the war to end all wars. Here in the Ohio River Valley, cold and snowy weather was fast approaching. Blizzard snow began falling on Saturday, December the 8th. By Sunday morning, the Louisville newspaper was reporting 16 inches of snow on the ground. High winds drifted it as high as 6 feet in some places. All traffic came to a near halt. Bitterly cold winds ensured that the snow would remain on the ground for days to come. Temperatures remained below zero on Monday, with little hope of improvement before the end of the week. The railroad was finding it difficult to maintain regular schedules, but slowly, as the days passed, the snowfall ended and the temperature crept upward. The morning of December 20th broke bright and clear. With Christmas fast approaching, families in outlying towns were anxious to take the train to the city. Most wanted to get in their shopping. Others had postponed businesses to attend to. The morning train pulled away from the Springfield depot, already partly full. It picked up passengers along the way to Louisville, stopping especially at Bardstown and Shepherdsville. The day passed, and nearly 100 people met at the 10th Street Depot in Louisville that evening. While we've not been able to obtain pictures of all the passengers, here are some that we do have. Some pictures come from microfilmed copies of newspapers, which accounts for their poor quality. In this frame are Nelson County Attorney Redford Cherry with his wife Carrie and their son Redford Jr. Also shown here are John and Betty Phillips. He was Bardstown's town marshal. Shown here on the top row are Mac and Amelia Miller and Frank Darty. On the bottom row, Mabel Brown Miller, Ben Talbot, and Emily Mashburn, all of Nelson County. Mac was a successful local businessman in Bardstown. Frank was an important lawyer. Mabel was married to T.J. Miller, a bank cashier. Ben Talbot worked in the Revenue Service, and Emily was married to H.H. Mashburn, a Baptist minister. Here are Nathaniel and Cora Muir, Garnett McKay Moore, Annie Reed, and Susie Shekels. Nathaniel was a successful Nelson County banker. Garnett was married to Tom Moore, a local distiller. Annie Reed was traveling with Mrs. Louisa Hurst as a nanny for the Hurst baby. And Susie Shekels was a longtime nurse and nanny for the Simmons family of Bullitt County. Shown here are Tom Spaulding, a student athlete at Notre Dame, and Mary Sims, who was attending St. Mary's School for Girls near South Bend. These two had missed the morning train by minutes and were anxious to board the evening train for home. Here too in the middle is Frank Nunn, who worked for the railroad and was on his way to Nazareth College to handle holiday ticket sales. Next is Eliza Craven, who was taking her children Raymond and Anna to visit their uncle in Nelson County for the holidays. And then Lucas Moore is on the end. He was a government field agent for the Agriculture Department. All these and many more were anxious for the train's departure from Union Station. The train they would board was called the Springfield Accommodation. It consisted of the locomotive, a baggage car, and 2 passenger coaches. The locomotive was a twin to the one shown here. The passenger cars were largely constructed of wood. They were drafty in the winter and subject to overcrowding. At 4:35, the train began its trip south. In 1917, all of Kentucky was on Central Time, which would make its departure at 5:35 according to our clock today. It left on time, but lost precious minutes along the way. By the time it reached Brooks Station, it was already 6 minutes behind schedule. Meanwhile, back at the 10th Street station, an express train had pulled out 18 minutes behind the Accommodation, heading south toward Nashville. It should have left the station ahead of the local train, but it was late. Its engineer needed to make up lost time. This express train was larger and more powerful. It was pulled by locomotive number 230, shown here. This locomotive was a K4 class 462 Pacific type. It included 9 passenger cars that were mostly made of steel. The Louisville train dispatcher called the station master at Brooks at 5:08. He suggested that the Accommodation train's conductor head into the siding at Shepherdsville unless he thought he could reach the Bardstown Junction turnoff before the express train caught up to him. Without a direct order to take the Shepherdsville siding, Conductor Campbell of the Accommodation decided to make a regular stop at Shepherdsville. He planned to check with the station master to see if he needed to back into the siding. As Campbell's train was coming to a halt at Shepherdsville, the express train was passing Brooks Station, just 5 miles north. Some passengers exited the Accommodation while others boarded it, including Thomas Hoagland, Jimmy Morrison, and Hoagland's lawyer, Ben Chappice. Hoagland's case against the railroad had adjourned for the evening, and they were heading home. Father Eugene Bertello and David and Howard Merriman were also among those who boarded the train. Father Bertello was on his way to visit a sick parishioner. The Merrimans planned to ride the train across the river to their homes. Campbell questioned the station master, who had no information for him. He knew from experience that a number of folks would disembark at the small depot just south of the river, including Mrs. Simmons, her daughter Susan, and Susan's nanny, Miss Shekels. Campbell called Louisville for more information, while the station master put up the green color signal to indicate that the track was occupied. After his call, Campbell ordered the porter to tell the train engineer to pull the train forward and then back into the siding. Meanwhile, the express train was just passing Gap and Knob. It was dark outside. At this time, the flagman should have already placed flares along the track behind the Accommodation to warn oncoming trains. Perhaps because of the confusion about taking the siding, he failed to do so. It was the duty of any engineer to approach a station with his train under control, and not to pass it unless he received a proceed signal. This signal in the night was the changing of a red light to a green light. The approaching engineer was supposed to stop unless he actually saw a red light change to green. The express train's engineer saw the green signal when he was about 2,200 feet from the station. He sounded 4 short blasts at 1,800 feet. This was the signal to the station requesting stop or proceed directions. He saw no change in the light, but past experience led him to think that either the station operator had already changed the light to green or that it would change before he reached the station. Station operators often did this. At 1,200 feet, he signaled again. When the accommodations porter threw the switch to enable his train to back into the siding, the light changed to red. Seeing this, the express train's engineer applied his emergency brakes. Seconds later, he saw the other train in front of him. It was too late. Brakes slowed the express to about 25 miles per hour, but its forward momentum and great weight imploded the back of the rear passenger car, sending fragments of wood and glass forward into the car and its passengers. It continued forward, shattering the sides of the car. The roof dropped down on passengers' heads. The locomotive continued through the length of the car, shattering it completely. It scattered splinters and broken glass debris and bodies to both sides of the track. Other bodies were trapped on the massive engine as it smashed into the next car. In seconds it was over, but the horror was just beginning. The scenes you will see next are from pictures taken the next day and are shared on the historical marker. Locals view the mangled wreckage. In the distance is the Trundle Hotel. The building is still there today. Here is the wreckage of a demolished train car. The 2nd Street underpass is just at the right edge of this photo. A heavily damaged passenger car rests alongside the track among the debris. Here you see the damaged front of the express train's locomotive. And here is the splintered wooden framework of a passenger car. This Christmas shopping list was found in Carrie Mae Simmons' purse. She died at the wreck. Townspeople and local doctors rushed to the scene, trying to help those who had survived. The dead were moved to a makeshift morgue in the Baptist Church building. A call went out to Louisville, and a special train was sent with doctors and nurses. It transported the wounded to a Louisville hospital. There, more would die from their injuries. When the tally was complete, 49 lives had been lost in this tragedy. Perhaps as many or more suffered injuries, many severe. Of these, Mr. Hoagland was one of the worst. According to a later report in the local paper, his left leg was broken below the knee, kneecap broken, elbow crushed, face cut all to pieces, head mashed, right side hurt, with several other parts broken. His family later remembered that Thomas wore a permanent brace on one leg. He nearly always wore a hat to cover the steel plate inserted in his head. Moving to the front of the smoker car had likely saved his life, as well as the lives of Annie Reed, Susie Shekels, and young Susan Simmons, who all escaped with minor injuries. Eliza Craven's body was badly shattered, but she would live. Her baby girl, Annie, was miraculously tossed from the wreckage, wrapped in her blanket. She landed in a pile of snow, unhurt, and was rescued by townspeople who cared for her until her father arrived from Louisville. The railroad was quick to clear the tracks. The next day, wrecking crews removed the locomotives and burned up the debris. The paper reported that broken bits of dolls, children's furniture, and other Christmas presents were found among the debris. They were also quick to begin trying to determine what financial costs this tragedy would bring for the company. The day after Christmas, A.M. Warren, chief law agent for the railroad, was in Bardstown, where he would make a list of the minimum amounts various families might accept as compensation for their losses. Many of these cases would find their way into the court system before being settled. Everyone wanted to know who to blame for this terrible accident. The railroad fixed the blame on the Accommodation's conductor, Milan Campbell, and its flagman, Lawrence Greenwell, both of whom had perished in the crash, and on William Wolfenberger, the engineer of the express train. The Interstate Commerce Commission agreed, but added an indictment of the railroad itself for failing to maintain a manual block system rather than the time interval system then in place. The time interval system was supposed to prevent trains from being closer than 10 minutes traveling time, but failed to do so this time. A manual block system permitted only one train at a time along a set block of track. As we bring this to a close, we honor the memory of those who lost their lives in this tragedy. Father Eugenio Bertello, Joshua Bethel Bowes, Holly Bridges, Josie Bridges, Milan Campbell, Carrie Barkhurst Cherry, Redford Columbus Cherry, William Redford Cherry, Raymond Thomas Craven, George C. Duke, Virginia Francis Duke, Lawrence Greenwell, Henry Zollicoffer Hardaway, Martha Jones Maddie Harmon, Joseph Raoul Hurst, Louisa Lawson Hurst, Catherine Cundiff Kate Ice, Charles William Johnson, Silas C. Lawrence, David Henry Merriman, Emily Haycraft Mashburn, Elizabeth McElroy, Amelia Smith Miller, Walter McMacken Mac Miller, Lillian Jones Miller, Mabel Brown Miller, Garnett McKay Moore, Lucas Moore, James Hartwell Jimmy Morrison, Cora Mae Shadburn Muir, George Shadburn Muir, Nathaniel Whitcliffe Muir, Frank Linus Nunn, Estelle Harris Nutt, Forrest Overall, Maggie Overall, David Phillips, Elizabeth Wright Betty Phillips, John T. Phillips, Mary Alice May Pulliam, Emory Bemis Samuels, Thomas William Schaefer, Carrie Mae Brown Simmons, Mary Althea Sims, William Thomas Sims Spalding, James W. Stansberry, Ben Talbot, James W. Thompson, N. H. Thompson. There is much more to this story. If you're interested in learning more, I've written a book about it that is available from the Bullitt County History Museum or online at Amazon. All proceeds from its sale go to support the museum's work. This has been a presentation of the Bullitt County History Museum. Thank you for joining us.